Well, welcome to everyone as you're all joining in. Thank you very much for joining us this evening for the next Society of Church Archaeology lecture. As usual, we'll just give it a minute or so while people connect through. So I hope you're all well. We can feel winter coming upon us, I think, everywhere, certainly everywhere in this country at the moment. I'm sure some of you are probably in more exotic climes, but before we start, I will just give another apology if any of you were signed up to our last lecture in October. As you will know, we had some techno gremlins get into the system, which basically created a bit of a meltdown. So, we apologize that we weren't able to deliver that lecture, but our speaker has agreed to come back next year and present that talk. So you won't be missing out. It'll be delayed. Oh, we've got somebody from Essex. Excellent. Good to see. We'll just give it another minute. So as usual, I'm sure you all know the form now, but essentially, oh, California, okay, this is where it starts getting exotic and makes one very jealous. As you all know, the ritual now, if you have any questions for our speaker during her talk, just pop them in the chat box. And Rob will go through and present some questions at the end. Otherwise, I'll introduce the talk in a second. I'm just being distracted by seeing where you're all from. We have a slightly sort of Western bias towards the United States, that sort of thing. Excellent, great. It's fantastic. No, I mean, it's genuinely fantastic to see people from literally all around the world, and Essex as well. That's great. We really appreciate you joining these lectures, which of course are absolutely free. So all I would do is urge you to consider joining the society so we can continue to produce this sort of material. I'm sorry, I'm trying not to smoke at Normal in Illinois. I don't know, is there actually, I was going to say, is there a Strange in Illinois, but there probably is. Right, anyway, I think it's time for me to shut up. So I will introduce our speaker today, who is Emily Bowyer-Kazadi. I knew I was going to stumble on your surname. Kazadi, is that correct?
Kazadi.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. It's been a long day here. Anyway, Emily is a PhD student at the University of Liverpool, who's currently undertaking a thesis on evaluating public engagement and narratives within the archaeological landscapes of the Peak District, Yorkshire Dales and North York Moors. So looking at one of the finest parts of the country, I think, and I suspect her doctoral work is what she'll be drawing upon tonight, because she's going to be telling us or talking to us about Deconstructing All Saints Church, Bakewell, which I have to say is one of my absolutely favourite churches. So I will hand over to Emily and she will tell us all about it.
Okay, great. Thank you very much for the introduction and the invite to speak. I'm just going to share my screen. So then if I put that on. Okay, great. So again, I'm Emily. I'm from Bakewell, where my main case study today is. So it's somewhere that I know very well. And this is one of my favourite views of the church, from just below it up through the graveyard. And just before I start, I will just say that all the photos, unless stated otherwise, are my own. So this presentation will focus on one element of my PhD research, which is called deconstructed landscape photography. And I'll come back to that in a minute because it may be something that most people haven't really heard of. So the contents for this talk, I will give a brief introduction and then give a background onto what my PhD research is all about, And then I will come on to the case study of Deconstructing All Saints Church in Bakewell. So I'll talk about the history of the church, its importance, especially in regarding its Anglo-Saxon and early medieval sculpture. And then I'll look at previous work on the church, and then I will come on to deconstruct it before coming to a discussion, some recommendations, and finally conclusion. So now looking at the PhD research as a whole, and then introducing deconstructed landscape and discussing how this can contribute to church archaeology, but also to archaeology as a whole. And then my case study, as I said, is All Saints Church in Bakewell, Derbyshire, which is where I'm from and I'm living at the moment. But I'm currently in Liverpool, so doing it from a distance, but obviously get to see All Saints pretty much every day when I'm round and about Bakewell and the Peak District in general. So looking at the background of the church and the research in general, the main themes of my PhD research are looking at archaeological landscapes, managing them, engagement within them, how people, different groups of people engage with archaeological landscapes within the context of British National Park, and how we perceive them, and then maybe how these perceptions have changed over recent years. And then looking at the links between archaeological landscape and well-being, identity, equality, diversity and inclusivity, access, sustainability, and then looking at the impact that COVID-19 has had throughout the last couple of years on all of these issues. And I kind of chose these issues because they're all quite important at the moment. For example, we've got the COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh at the moment. So that's where the sustainability comes in, and, you know, big demonstrations like we've had with Black Lives Matter, Me Too, all these things are really important to bring into my research. Identity is important because we have both individual, local, regional, national, global identities. And all of these will impact on how we engage with archaeology and our past. And obviously well-being is quite linked to COVID. So how is that, you know, access to archaeological landscapes affected our well-being, especially over the last few years? So now briefly looking at my research questions for the PhD. These really reflect the aims and the themes that I want to talk about, and to find out more about how different people perceive these themes. So looking at, you know, how people engage with archaeological landscapes, that's really the most important thing to start with, is understanding how people engage. And then how understanding this can allow us to share our knowledge of the archaeological landscapes within, for example, my context of British national parks, and to different groups, because obviously there's going to be different levels of understanding. So for example, talks like this is one way, but then you're going to have different levels. There'll be more formal conferences, local talks, that kind of thing. And then these just kind of go through the other topics that I mentioned before. So the methodology, so this is the methodology again for my whole PhD. Doing the theoretical background, it's very heavily based in pragmatism and interpretivism. And I'm taking a very narrative approach because I'm really interested in people's stories, people's experiences, and how they share what they feel about a landscape, how they connect to it, what it means to them. So there is a mixed methods design in it. So I have both quantitative elements and qualitative. I'm not very good at statistics, so the quantitative method is very limited to a questionnaire that I've created. It's accessed online. I've got a poster with a QR code that will take people to the link of the questionnaire, and then I also have paper copies for those who are not maybe able to access the internet or don't understand how to use a QR code. So this was one of my ways of addressing issues of access so that I can reach a wider range of people. And then qualitative methods, I've done interviews, I'm organizing photo groups, focus groups even, and observation as well at the different places that I go and do my photography. So looking at visual methods, the last method that I'm using is deconstructed landscape photography. And this is what my focus for the talk will be tonight. So many of you are probably wondering, what on earth is deconstructed landscape photography? Well, it's this. So if you see the panel on the left-hand side here, this is a method that was introduced by Scottish photographer Neil Benvie in 2015. Neil is a very experienced landscape and wildlife photographer who is from Brechin in Angus, so kind of in between Aberdeen and Dundee on the East Coast. And he now lives in France and runs photography retreats and teaches people how to do photography. And I must kind of mention, just to kind of avoid any conflict of interest, he happens to be my stepfather. So I get a lot of lessons and a lot of help with learning how to do this. But I've taken this method and kind of done something quite different with it and tried to make it my own, because I just think it's a really good way of kind of getting people to think about heritage and archaeological sites in a different way. So for the method, it's, instead of taking just a generic landscape shot like the ones that I've shown earlier of the church, and it's very pretty, instead of doing that, you take a photo of each different element. So you can see here, we've got bits of the sky, the trees, the bark on the trees, the water, the pebbles, moss, lichen, plants, and then you put them together in a panel. There's no one shot that's more important than another. They're all equally important. And I think it really shows, like, as I've said here, the intention is to show the variety of the place. And it makes landscape photography, and for my work, archaeological and heritage photography, quite a lot more relatable. And it can also reflect experiences of non-photographers and also non-professionals in a sense. So the focus is just really on individual elements rather than the whole. It's a good method to work with because it is very difficult to replicate. Even when I've been doing various panels for this talk and for the rest of my PhD, no panel looks the same. And obviously I'm doing it from my perspective, but then someone else will have a completely different view to it. So it's a very novel way of photographing landscapes, and it's just a really different take on looking at places, which I really enjoy. However, it is very, very time consuming because you have to take the individual shots, then you have to edit them, and then you have to put them in the panel and make sure that they're all right. Luckily, I now have some templates that I can use, so that makes it a lot faster to do. And also for looking at printing, because they're normally quite big, the printing cost can be very high. And for me, I'll come back to this later, but I want to be able to put them on roller banners so that they can be transported and used in exhibitions and focus groups. So this panel is one that Neil did a few years ago now in 2015, the Ganachie Gorge, which is near Brechin in Angus. So that's the basics of what deconstructed landscape photography is. So now I'll just briefly introduce my case studies. So here we've got all the national parks in the UK, there's 15, and in England and Wales, 10% of our land is covered by national parks. So they are quite different to other national parks in the US and in other countries, because the majority of it is actually privately owned. So I think in the Peak District, the National Park Authority only owns about 3-4% of the land. The rest belongs to local landowners or maybe like local governments, that kind of thing. So it's really very different. So within each of the 3 case studies that I've chosen, there's different sites that I'm focusing on. And one of those in the Peak District is All Saints Church in Bakewell. So looking down at the church, away from the church, down to the graveyard, and then over the town. So this is a view from the church. So when I was making this presentation up, I thought, okay, what's going to be the main question that I want to answer? So what I came up with was, can deconstructed landscape photography create new ways of engaging with church archaeology? So that's kind of what I aim to answer from at the end of this talk. So the location, I'll come to some maps in a minute so that you kind of have a general idea of where we are in the UK. So this is one of the bigger towns of the Peak District. We've got about 4,000 people. It's largely an older population. So I would say the majority of people from Bakewell in their 20s and 30s go to other places like Sheffield, Nottingham, Derby, maybe Chesterfield for work, because there's more opportunities there. So it is generally an older population, and then lots of tourists who come in to visit. We've got a very long history going back to the prehistoric times. And, you know, we're very famous for the Bakewell pudding, if any of you heard of that. The original is very different from the ones that are made by a certain baking company. So if you ever get a chance to go to Bakewell, I would always say try the pudding and not the tart, because it's far better. So we get lots of visitors coming to try the Bakewell pudding, and they go to the Rutland Arms as well to have a drink, because that's where the pudding was originally created. And it was a favorite of people such as Charles Dickens and Jane Austen, who visited the town fairly regularly for a break in their travel. So we also have the remains of a castle. You can't really see it because it's a Moss and Bailey castle, so there's not a lot to see of that. And we have the Old House Museum, which is very near to the church. So I'll point those out when we come to the maps. So just to come back to the map, again here, this is the Peak District. And if you look on the right, Bakewell is kind of on the bottom right-hand corner. I always think that the Peak District looks a bit like a kidney, but it's a lovely place to be. And then this is a map of the town. So we've got the old market hall down here, which is very close to the river. The old castle is up here, but again, it's just a mound, you can't really see very much. There's an old house around here. Down at the other end, you've got, outside of the town, you've got Haddon Hall, which is owned by Lord Edward Manners, and that's open to the public as well. Sorry, I'm just going to have to keep moving the screen. So then you have the church here, and it's up on a hill. It's quite a walk to get up there. And then above that, you have the Old House Museum. And there are quite close links between the museum and the church. So there's also just a few nice old buildings in the town itself, and there's an old mill down here and an old pack horse bridge, and then we've got one of the oldest bridges in the country, I think, over the main bit of the River Wye. So then now just to zoom in a little bit closer, here is the church on the Historic England listing site. So it's a Grade 1 listed building since 1951. And you can see here, it's quite a big church, and it's got an interesting, very interesting layout, which again, I'll come back to later on. So the Historic England website it's got a good description of the church and good information about what's actually there and things like that. So why did I choose All Saints Church? So many reasons, really. The interesting history, it's got a very long history, which I'll come back to in a moment. So it's been around since the Anglo-Saxon period, and it kind of is a good example of how the church has evolved through time. So it's got very little of the Anglo-Saxon parts left, but then it's got developments through from the 1000s onwards. So it's also got some brilliant examples of Anglo-Saxon and early medieval sculpture, and there's two crosses as well. Again, I'll come back to this because it is one of the most important features of the church, and it is local for me. So I can literally walk from my house and I'll be there in 15 minutes, 20 minutes maybe on a slow day. So yeah, it's just, there are many reasons why I chose it, and it's just one place that I really love to go and always look around, and every time I will see something different. So this is again another reason why I chose it for the deconstructed landscape photography, because I feel that it's really a really good place to kind of practice, and there's so many different things to see, which I hope you'll see later on in the pictures that I've done. So looking at the history of the church, it was first built in the Anglo-Saxon period, but there has been a Christian presence in the area since before that, since the Roman period. There was a bit of the Christians kind of disappeared for a little while and then came back with Anglo-Saxon missionaries. It was extended and developed during the Norman period. So Bakewell, along with several other areas, including the town of Castleton, were given by William the Conqueror to William Peveril, who it said that was one of William the Conqueror's illegitimate sons. And so he was very instrumental in extending and developing the Norman church, and bits of that we can still see today. And there was lots of modernizations and additions from the 13th century onwards, and a lot of work was also done in the 1800s. So this is where a lot of the period where a lot of the stained glass comes from, and there was a lot of repair to the spire because that fell down. So a lot of this was done in the 1800s. So the main features of the church are the spire, which is in the shape of a crucifix, stained glass windows, the Anglo-Saxon and early medieval sculpture, monuments and plaques. There's a beautiful organ and a medieval font. Again, I will show more of these photos later. It's just I wanted to kind of get the main points of why it's important and why I chose it. So it's been a Grade 1 listed building since the 13th of March, 1951. And this means that there is a lot of restrictions on any building work, especially because it's within the national park. So when any work gets done, there's a lot of red tape to get through, a lot of different steps that you have to take to be able to do anything. And if you look down here, you can see in the metal railings, that is the Anglo-Saxon cross, which I'll show in more detail later. So earlier on, I mentioned Lord Edward Manners, who is the honorary president of the Friends of Bakewell Church. Now, the Friends of Bakewell Church are really instrumental in running the church, doing fundraising to, do repairs, that kind of thing. They organize concerts. They've got one coming up near Christmas with a band that use traditional instruments and things like that. I can't remember what they're called, but that's been done in conjunction with the museum. And this is just a really nice quote from Lord Edward, just about the church. And if you look on the plan here, I'm sorry about all the fire escape things, it's the only plan that I could find. You can see the Vernon Chapel here next to the Newark. And the Vernons were a really important family in Bakewell's history, and they are the ancestors of Lord Edward. So especially you had Dorothy Vernon, who established the school in Bakewell, Lady Manners School. So it's a really important part of the church, that in itself, with the Vernon Chapel. So that's again something that I'll come back to later on. And you can see here outside the south porch, or the south porch, this is where all the majority of the Anglo-Saxon and early medieval sculpture is held. And there's 5 stone coffins on the outside of the church, which again, I'll show you a photo of in a minute. So the sculpture at All Saints Church, this is one of the main things that drew me to using this as a case study, because it's one of the biggest collections of Anglo-Saxon and also Anglo-Scandinavian early medieval sculpture. with 37 pieces of sculpture. There's inscriptions dating to the first half of the 10th century, in the middle of the conflict between Saxons and Scandinavians. There's 2 stone crosses, carved stone fragments, and 5 stone coffins. So you can just see, even from this picture, there is a lot of different work. It's all been kind of piled on top of each other, a little bit higgledy-piggledy, but that's how they've decided to store it. And some of them, as you can see here, are very intricate. So the previous work at All Saints Church is actually something that I've been involved with. There was the project in 2012, Decoding the Bakewell Cross. I was a volunteer at the excavation, and the aim was to interpret and understand the Anglo-Saxon sculpture. And there was an excavation which I was involved in just before my graduation from Cardiff University, and I did the dig where they were trying to find the base of the Anglo-Saxon cross. So this was run by Archaeological Research Services Limited, which is a commercial archaeology company based in Bakewell. I've done a lot of work with them, both volunteer and paid work in the past, and they ran this project really well, but they were partnered with the Bakewell Historical Society, who run the museum. And then there's also the Parochial Council of Bakewell Church and Birmingham University. Now, Birmingham University were brought in to create the laser images of the stones to capture their detail and assess the condition, as well as, there was a lot of work studying textual records, antiquarian illustrations, and of course the excavation, which produced a lot of interesting information. And there was also something that happened a year later called the Bakewell Moot, which I was also involved in through my involvement with the museum and Bakewell Youth Theatre. So this took place in 2013, and it was basically a community reenactment of the meeting of different Anglo-Saxon tribes, which took place in Bakewell at 920 AD. There is a video on YouTube, so if you just type in, as you can see at the bottom, Decoding the Bakewell Crosses, the AD 920 Moot, you'll probably see a video of me dressed up as an Anglo-Saxon lady. And basically we had these lovely wooden crosses made by a local woodworker that you can see here. And each one was to represent a different tribe, and they all came together and from different directions in this old quarry. And then we met and they did a little reenactment of what was happening. So that was organised by the Bakewell Old House Museum, run by the Historical Society, the church, and the Youth Theatre, which I used to be in, and now I help out with when I have free time. So that's quite an interesting thing. If anyone's interested, I can also put the link in the chat later on. So other work that I found, there's been several books and internet articles, a lot of work that can be found in the museum, in the church, and also in the local visitor centre. There's lots of books around, on the church. And I also found this website called Find a Grave. And this basically, you can add information about the graves within different cemeteries around the country. So you can see on the slide the cemetery ID here and the location, its coordinates. It's got 815 memorials recorded. And then you can add memorials, you can add photos, and they're all put on a map. So it's quite interesting, and that's something that I might use at a later date to put into a deep map, which I'll come back to in the recommendations at the end of the presentation. So why have I chosen deconstructed landscape photography? Just a bit of a recap. For me, I think it's a new way of looking at churches, not just churches, but archaeology as a whole, as it focuses on details within a place. I think it could possibly be a new way of cataloguing churches, maybe with the objects in them as well. It could be a new way of sharing knowledge about the church. If I do, for example, if I want to put the pictures in the panels onto banners or canvases, or maybe even a photo book, this could be done, and this could be used to get people thinking about what's actually in a church. And then, you know, they can maybe go and do it themselves, or they start to look for different things within the church and within the surrounding areas as well. So this is kind of why I'm using it, and it's a method that I've loved for, well, since 2015 when it came out. So now we get to look at the photos. So I've done quite a few. So these are the stone coffins here that I mentioned before. There's 5 of them. Every source I've looked at doesn't give the specific date, but I would say that they're quite old, early medieval possibly. Some different tombstones, and then the windows and the doors. So this is my first panel that I did for the exterior of the church. And it's really just kind of focusing on the details. For example, these bits of the doors. Here you've got the brass or the metal fittings, sculpture, detailed sculpture, a bit of a, you know, an inscription of a gravestone that's worn away, the walls, the floor, part of the Anglo-Saxon cross and the railings here, more details of the sculpture. So I just basically went around with my camera and I took photos of what I noticed and I found interesting and put them into a panel. So I do have a lot more to do because I took hundreds and hundreds of photos, but I've just prepared a couple for the presentation for each area of the church that I went to. So this is another one of just things from the outside. So you can see, even though I've used a couple of photos that are the same, so I use this one and this one, it still looks different. So even though I've used similar photos, I focus in on other aspects as well, and just to show how you can put them together in a panel and how it can look different. So again, I've used this one because I just found the stone coffins really, really interesting. A completely different way. I'd never seen them anywhere else. And then you've got tiles with decoration on them, and then more kind of like eroded sculpture, and then still really intricate sculpture here. So moving on now to the interior. So this image here is of the medieval font, so that's kept inside and protected from the elements. You've got different memorials, and then the organ here. So you also have the stained glass windows. These are just some of them that are in the church. These are kind of later, so more kind of 1800s period. And then when I was deconstructing the interior, you can see I chose some of the stained glass and then some of the sculpture, decorative elements, also with the wreath for remembrance, which I thought was quite important, especially this time of year, and some of the woodwork. And just, yeah, these are from the Vernon Chapel, which I'll come back to in a moment. And just all the sculpture that and the details that's within the church, I think is really interesting. So moving on to the Vernon Chapel, which I mentioned also earlier, very important for the Manners family who live at Haddon Hall. So you have these kind of 2 memorials, one at either end. So you've got this big one, and then in the middle there's this tomb and another couple of tombs, and then the other memorial altarpiece at the end. So this was my deconstruction of the Vernon Chapel. Again, you've got some really detailed sculpture work, especially with the hairstyles, the clothes, although there is some graffiti on it as well from various years. I think I saw a date of 1750 or something like that, and on the sculpture of on the tombstones. So it's really interesting to see the different periods that you get on that. And again, just the intricate wood carving, which is really lovely, and especially with the again, like I said, the hairstyles and the clothing, and even here on the chainmail, I just think it's really interesting to think about that detail and put it in the photos. So again, looking at the sculpture, so here you have the sculpture that's in the south porch, and then this is the Anglo-Scandinavian cross and the Anglo-Saxon cross, which is, as you can see, got a bit of damage at the top there. So in the church itself, there are boards with information on, so it tells you a bit about each cross and sets the context for them as well. And there's also some matching boards down in the town centre, done by ARS, Archaeological Research Services, and they just tell you a bit about the excavation and the decoding the Bakewell crosses project. So if you are ever in Bakewell and you go down, you'll be able to read some information. They've got QR codes as well to take you to the website. So this is another deconstruction of the sculpture where I just focused in on different elements, and I just found it really interesting to kind of see what level of detail there is on there. So obviously there's also the laser work that was done by Birmingham University as part of the decoding the Bakewell crosses project. So it will be interesting to kind of compare the photos that I have with the laser scans to see how the level of detail is in comparison between now and 2012. Here's another one that I did. I especially like these ones. They were in the south porch, and it's just interesting to see the different faces that they have, and just again the level of detail within the sculpture that's there. So sorry, that's gone backwards. So now this is the last deconstruction that I've got of the church, and this is of well dressing. So if you're not from Derbyshire, you probably won't know what this is, or if you're from the surrounding areas, you may have heard of it. So well dressing is a tradition that we have that runs from May to September every year. Different towns do it and villages do it at different times. And basically you'll have a big board that you see here, and it's covered in clay, and then pictures are put onto it using all natural materials, so like flowers, you've got moss, grass, soil, leaves, wool. So this year was obviously a big year. We had the Jubilee, as you can see, and then there was another one at Hartington that I saw which had Paddington Bear saying "Thank you, Mum," and that was just put on display not long after the Queen passed away. So that had a real double level of meaning because it was very poignant at the time. And just the amount of detail that goes into these well dressings. So, you know, making sandwiches from pebbles and petals and leaves. And then, you know, the tea and the flags and the writing. So this is a really lovely local tradition that we have. So I'm happy that I got the opportunity to do this one in Bakewell by the church, and then a few others in surrounding towns and villages as well. So thinking now about the current state of archaeology, of engagement with church archaeology, from what I've seen from All Saints in Bakewell, there's a church website which is very comprehensive. They've got a bit about the history, as you can see here. So if you type in All Saints Church Bakewell onto Google, you'll find it, and there's a lot of information on the website. There's the Find a Grave website that I mentioned earlier before, if you're interested in finding out about the people who were actually in the cemetery. There's the ARS, there's 2 reports by ARS and the display panels in town, and the display of sculpture and the information boards. There's also guidebooks, local town tours, which are run by the museum, and you can go in and visit the church. It's open all the time. So this is kind of what there is at the moment. So there is a lot, but maybe I think we need to find new ways of engaging with the archaeology. And this is where the deconstructed landscape photography could come in. So coming back to my question that I had at the start when I was preparing this talk, how can deconstructed landscape photography create new ways of engaging with church archaeology? So I was thinking maybe we can create a typology for architectural styles, you know, thinking of doing like a panel for different areas within the church, different types of, for example, you could do one on stained glass windows, or you could do one on the organ or the font, different areas within a church. And it can kind of also be a way of cataloging change in architectural styles, that kind of thing. But the main thing I think is it would encourage people to think about the archaeology of a church in a different way. So there's, especially because there's no wrong way of doing it. You know, everyone is different. I'm sure everyone else here would look at something differently to how I do. So it's just a really nice way for people to start thinking about how they see, how they perceive, you know, a church or any other type of archaeology. So the main thing that I want to do kind of moving forward, and I'll come back to this in a bit, is to be printing these panels on banners, canvases, photo books, as I've mentioned, and then they can form part of an exhibition. This would be transportable, so it can go into different places. So I could have it at the church, could move it up to the museum or the visitor centre where we've got a space for displaying artist work. There's also the Medway Centre, which is a community centre. There's a town hall. And these could also, as well as being used as an exhibition, will be a point of discussion in a focus group, which is what I hope to do kind of over the next few months, is to get these printed and then use them in my focus groups. Also doing maybe guided walks to teach people how to do the photos and then create the panels. So that's one thing that I would also aim to do in the future, maybe in partnership with the church and the museum, and obviously the Peak District National Park as well. So my recommendations for moving forward with this particular project is to print the photos onto banners, as I've just mentioned, to also use them within focus groups for my PhD research, and they will be portable, reusable, so aiming to be sustainable, which is one of my main themes of my research that I want to do. Could do talks at the church, including the other interest groups, and thinking of different range of people to give talks to. So again, for example, talking to everybody here today, and then, you know, doing in-person talks where I could also use the banners and photo books as well. One thing that I'm looking at doing, and this was an initial idea that I had for my PhD, but thinking about it now, it would be too complicated, and once I finish, the deep map will be lost. So I want to create a deep map, which is kind of a multi-layered map, like we've seen, where you can click on different bits of it and it will bring up photos or maybe videos of interviews, audios, using links to websites like Find a Graveyard, and using information from the archaeological reports, and then putting them all together in one place, and then also allowing people to add to that as well. So it's quite complicated, which is why I've kind of left it for a later date, but that is something that I'm thinking of doing in the future. And then also making sure that I've done a full stakeholder analysis. So I've got some already, but then thinking further, who else is involved in the church that would need to be involved in any projects that are being done there. So I think I'm just about on time, hopefully. So in conclusion, this has been a really useful case study within my PhD as a whole, but also just interesting to do it individually because it is somewhere that I really love. You know, again, I say I walk past the church at least 2-3 times a week. And it's helped me in developing my deconstructed landscape photography. There is good engagement in place. However, I think it would be interesting to go in some different directions, and to develop the engagement for the future. So that is everything that's for my presentation. This is just select bibliography. My actual bibliography is a lot longer and would probably take about 100 slides. So just kind of added some of the most important ones there. And again, I'm happy to share any links there. And thank you for your attention.
Right, thank you, Emily. That was a very sort of comprehensive overview, particularly if anyone's not been to Bakewell. You know, that gives a real flavour of the place and its setting. Also, it was a very good advert for Bakewell pudding, which I can back up as well. I guess I'll just ask a question. Obviously, at Bakewell, you've got so much. You've got, you know, obviously a fabulous church with everything that's going on in it. You've got, you know, from many archaeologists' perspectives, the early medieval sculpture and that. Do you find from your experience, partly as a local, but also from people you've talked to as part of your work, do you find there are aspects of Bakewell and the church that really grab people more? And, you know, are there narratives there that really engage communities? Because you know, you've got so many potential strands there that could connect with people and their experience. I mean, I was wondering, is there one thing about Bakewell where you find people repeatedly say, what about that aspect of it and the presentation of that?
It's difficult because there's so many people just think of Bakewell, oh, it's where the Bakewell tart comes from. But then it's like, well, that's not really all it is. And I think the church has actually done quite well in promoting what it's got in Bakewell. So I think for the main part, it really is the sculpture, the Anglo-Saxon early medieval sculpture that is the big draw for people. But it's very difficult because the locals, and I've seen this with my work in the Old House Museum as a trustee, the locals don't really bother coming up to the museum, and it's more kind of like the tourists that come. And I think it's kind of the same with the church. Unless you're a parishioner there, then you know you're going to the church for services. It probably is mostly the tourists that come up, and locals do tend to stay away a bit, especially when it's a bank holiday or it's some holidays, because the town can feel a bit overrun. So it's very difficult, and I think kind of pushing the local strands of it is really important because we don't want to lose that. And that's one thing that I kind of want to do in my research, especially looking at the identity. That local identity is really important to keep hold of. And especially with the local population, they are older. So that's very important to kind of pass it on to the younger generations who might not necessarily want to stay in Bakewell.
No, absolutely. I mean, this is always the tension you have with the different sort of constituencies of locals and tourists. Fantastic, thank you. Rob, do we?
Yeah, we've got some questions. Thank you, Emily. That was a good talk. A couple of questions here is, what criteria do you use when selecting photos to go in a particular panel?
For me, it's just kind of, I pick a theme. So for example, I had like the Vernon Chapel, and then I just kind of look through the photos that I have and think, oh, I like that one, I'll put that one in there. And then I basically just select almost what catches my eye at the time. And that's why kind of maybe there are some of the same photos in different panels, because I think they would also work. So it's just like a variation on what I think works. And that's why it's such a good way of doing things, because you know everyone will be different. So there's no right way of doing it, there's no wrong way of doing it. It's just, for me, it's what kind of catches my eye and how I think it will work together.
Yeah, no, that's good. That's interesting. Another one was, have you looked through, and I actually thought something similar, because when you were talking about the well dressing, it reminded me of these great old images I've seen of well dressing at Tissington. So someone has asked, John has asked, have you looked at Derbyshire archives for additional information and images which may be relevant?
Yes, so yeah, I have had a look well at the Derbyshire ones, and then also because the Peak District itself crosses several different counties, it's also important to look at those archives. So that's something that I've looked at briefly, but it will also be more work that I have to do later on once I've kind of got interviews and focus groups pinned down. Then I can start using more of those images.
Yeah, Good. Someone else has asked, Jane has asked, is there an active congregation? There is an active congregation.
Yeah.
How have they been engaging with this?
So they've generally been very good at engaging with it. So the vicar there, Canon Tony, he's very interested in engaging with different groups, and he's always really pushing it. There's the Friends of Bakewell Church, who I mentioned before. They're very, very active. So Mark, who's the chairman, he does a lot of work in organizing different things. So yeah, it's just really interesting to kind of see how much they kind of do. They do projects to raise money for the church, and they've done very well in raising thousands of money to help, thousands of pounds even, to help repair the church and do the information boards, that kind of thing.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think when you talk there about it's helped them to raise money to repair the church, is in some sense, I suppose, if you're taking regular records in these of different aspects of the building, you can track the maintenance of it, I suppose. And when you say that it's in a national park and it's grade 1 listed, it's quite difficult to do new work to it and alterations. But conversely, I suppose there's a responsibility there to maintain it. So they are really useful records. Someone has just put a really long comment in. I'm just going to have to just read this one. So Michael has asked, I took a walk around the church in the moonlight on Saturday evening and was struck by a few things. The variations in the plinth work showing various periods of building, stone coffins, which you showed, and the apparent Norman doorway to the west with dogtooth carving. Can DLP be used to show these buildings' characteristics?
Yes, very much so. I mean, because you're taking pictures of specific elements, but if you're going to photograph like specific things, obviously it might take a bit more work because you'd have to be able to get up high to photograph everything, but it very much could be used to help like archive these kind of things and record them. So it's got lots of different uses, which is one thing that really drew me to it.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you. I'll hand back to Hugh.
Thank you for handling that, Rob, and thank you again to our speaker, Emily. I can't say enough. If you're in Derbyshire in the Peak District, do go and visit Bakewell, because it is an absolutely fantastic place. Brilliant. Well, it just remains for me to let you know about our next talk, which is on the 6th of December, and that's being given by Dr. Kirsty Squires, who'll be talking about the Capuchin catacombs in Palermo. So slightly different location, slightly warmer. I happen to know that Kirsty's work has been looking at the occupants of the catacombs, and I think she's got a particular interest in children who are selected to go into catacombs, and by nature of the environment are often naturally mummified. So that's going to be potentially rather interesting. But otherwise, I hope you can all join us again next month. Please do continue supporting us, and thank you again to our speaker, Emily.
Thank you. And just quickly, I know a few of you have sent private messages, so I don't know if I'll be able to reply to them afterwards, but I'll put my email address in the chat just in case anyone wants to send me a question.
Fantastic. Thank you very much.